Hello and welcome to episode 211 of our SAP on Azure video podcast. Today is October 1st, and together with Robert and Goran, we are here to talk about anything related to SAP and Microsoft. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
So a few months ago, we had Vinayak from SAP on the show to talk about SAP API Management on the SAP Business Technology Platform. We talked about several single sign-on scenarios with Entra ID, or previously Azure Active Directory, as it was called back then. And we got a good overview of some of the single sign-on scenarios. Then we also had Martin with us a few weeks back, where he talked about single sign-on to the Power Platform. Well, today will be a really great episode again, because we bring both colleagues together to talk about single sign-on from SAP via SAP Business Technology Platform API Management to Power Platform. So welcome, everyone. As always, before we get started, maybe let's start with a quick introduction. Vinayak, our guest from SAP, maybe you can quickly get started.
Of course. Hey, Holger. Always a pleasure and honor to be here, and really loved talking to you folks last time around. And I believe it was in March, yeah. So like time just flies, 6 or 7 months. And a quick background. So I'm Vinayak Adkoli. I'm part of the product management team with Integration Suite, and I do all things API, so connectivity, security. So those are my go-to topics. And yeah, happy to be here as always, Holger.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Martin, over to you.
Same here. Also happy to be part of the show each time. Martin Pankraz. I'm part of the same team as Holger is. Product management in Azure Core, and I take care of the integration scenarios that we do between SAP as our partner and co-engineering partner, and on the Microsoft side, the product groups that interface with it. That includes Power Platform and Azure Integration Services and SAP Business Technology Platform, and its API management capability is like a central cornerstone in this integration story. Hence, we are collaborating. And it's always a pleasure with colleagues like Vinayak to have hands-on prototyping, like nailing really the problems together. And that's, to me, that's the best in part of the partnership.
Cool, perfect. Well, it's great to have both of you here. So Vinayak, the last time we spoke, there were a lot of different single sign-on scenarios. So maybe to kick us off, maybe you can give us a quick overview of what you have done with Martin. Why have you done it? And yeah, basically just set the scene.
Of course, and pictures always convey a lot of ideas. I'm going to share my screen real quick, and let me know once we are up and about. Okay, so I need to go to my presentation mode. And
perfect.
Okay, you see the good screen. Okay, so Holger, by the way, I wanted to kind of just put this information out there. So I was coincidentally attending a Gartner conference in the month of May, and guess what? So all the analysts very clearly highlighted that one of the go-to reasons why customers look at an API gateway is to solve the problem of API security, right? And I mean, clearly this stands out as the number one reason, right? And this is exactly the kind of weeds that we're getting into now. Yeah, so we are right on the money.
Perfect.
and having said that, so let's look at this whole jungle and maze of single sign-on principal propagation, right? And this is what I tend to call as the path that we've covered multiple times, right? And what's the scenario that I'm sure most of the listeners listening in, you've probably dealt this, and then you've seen solution blueprints. And mostly the idea is that client apps, they rely on BTP connectivity services, BTP XSUAA, to securely exchange and relay the security context, right? And this is in principle the sort of fundamentals or the backbone of what we do. So in that way, some of the approaches that we've spoken about in the past, again, principally relies on things like OpenID Connect, specifically the authorization code grant type. And we have the very famous and popular OAuth SAML bearer approaches that is based on RFC 7522 and the on behalf of flow. Yeah, something that we will again get into today. But the fundamental premise is that we rely on what we call as an X509 certificate generation approach, where the security context is extracted, and Cloud Connector and the connectivity components will essentially create a certificate on the fly, right? And this is all good for backends that rely on mutual TLS, security-based, a certificate-based approach to have connectivity done, right? So it's all good. And if this is the approach that customers are using, excellent, right? So more power to them. Having said that, we also know and we also hear that a lot of customers also end up having some kind of a direct trust relationship. And it's not very uncommon, right? Because Entra ID is really kind of pervasive. So while we have applications that end users authenticate to, we also have approaches where even at multiple levels, the on-prem backends are also connected with Entra ID, right? And we know the classical techniques like ADFS and then all of that. So for those customers, it's really not a big deal for them. And it's actually a welcome configuration where they want to have like a direct SAML trust handshake, between Entra and the backend. And I mean, customers do this all the time. And to those customers, we want to tell that if you actually are comfortable with setting up an OAuth client as the connectivity premise for your backend, and typically we have the famous OAuth node, right? So I'm calling this SAP BC Sec OAuth 2. So this is the node that needs to be activated. And then you need to go about a few procedural things that Martin will talk about on how you really set up this OAuth client. And once you do that, API management really helps you solve this problem of doing the token exchange, right? And this is something that essentially the other components in SAP are not very good at, right? So because BTP applications, space scoped applications, and including cloud integration, they rely directly on this secure connectivity, right? API management, on the other hand, can really do a token exchange process, which is exactly what we've accomplished using the policy template that Martin will help us through. So that's the secret sauce, right? So the idea is to really have authentication pass through without really having to go over the burden or the onus of the certificate generation. So we rely on OAuth to be our best friend over here, right? And Entra ID does actually a very good job of going about the mechanics of setting this trust. So all is good, right? So this is going to be the premise of how different we think the approach works. And maybe not just for backends like S4HANA, we actually are also working on demonstrating this also to a success factors backend as well, right? And we could actually talk about that towards the end of the episode. So that I would say is in a nutshell of the approach that we will be presenting today.
Perfect.
So
Thank
it's
you.
much more simple, Vinayak. I mean, the whole architecture is much more simple to set it up, to troubleshoot if needed, right?
Absolutely. I mean, troubleshooting is, I mean, I would say one of the biggest pros of this approach, right? Because I ran into a problem, and then there is this what's it called, the SecDiag transaction, which really gives me a breakdown of really where the token exchange is happening, how the user principal is presented, what's the kind of mapping that actually happened. So it's really a big blessing to have all those steps listed for you as part of the OAuth handshake.
Cool.
One part is security in APIs, right? But SAP API Management or the API Management solution in itself gives you also governance options. Yeah, because you handle all the things you want to handle in one place, yeah, and you treat it or you solve it for all the consumers. Yeah. We have Power Automate consuming, right? But any BTP app or any app that is Entra ID like authenticated can profit from this. Yeah? So it's a real governance like solver for you, yeah, to handle it in this one place.
Yeah, and then also from a monitoring perspective or something like that, this is my one single place where I need to look, where I can also then control who has access to what. And I mean, with API management, you have these API keys potentially that can be added on top, where you can then really differentiate. This should come from these client apps, from that client app. So with this one single piece, you have a nice single point of monitoring, of control.
Exactly, yeah. So good call out there, Goran. And we are focusing on the principal propagation part because that's one of the more complex parts of what you can do with API management. But of course, you profit from all the things available, like the throttling, the quota usage limits, all the things you can think about in caching, etc. Yeah? But that's why we're focusing on this aspect, because that's the tricky part for the customer.
Absolutely. And Martin, you've been kind enough to throw in most of those qualities in the policy template as well, right? So we actually do things like, caching and ensuring that we're not fetching a token every time if it's already active and available in the cache. So those are goodies that you could definitely put on the API gateway layer so that it's actually performant.
Exactly, yeah.
Perfect. So Martin,
Okay.
I think you have also created a blog post. One of, I don't know, how many blog posts do you have in the meantime? I think it's quite a lot.
I stopped counting, but I have an aggregator gallery to always find them quickly enough.
Great.
So this one I co-authored with Vinayak. Yeah? So that's the platform allows multiple authors, right? Vinayak and I have been written this together. And this is yet another drawing with a slightly different perspective, where we also have the trust relationship called out. Yeah? So because the setup requires BTP and Entra ID to trust each other, so that the token exchange is done in good faith, right? And as we already said, the policy is at the core of this, and SAP and Vinayak nicely helped putting this on the Business Accelerator Hub. So everyone that goes to this publicly available Business Accelerator Hub can find under the policy templates section this Entra ID entry down here. Yeah, and this is also where we will be adding on customer demand additional ones. Vinayak already hinted at the success factors one, yeah, so we are like in the final stages there. And then you get really a breakdown what's in here. Yeah? We've left enough nice comments and some references to explain what this is about, so that everyone can like find their way. And this is all explained from the blog post. And
But Martin,
yeah.
just one thing quickly, because this is something. I mean, if we look at the policy, this looks super complicated. There are so many steps there. But I think what you just said is really something that I want to highlight. Thanks to the SAP Business Accelerator Hub, any customer can just go there or and fetch this policy. So it's immediately available from my API management policy editor, basically. So you basically, there's no need to copy and paste stuff or whatever. Go to your blog post but you can really go to the API Accelerator Hub and then immediately have this policy in here. And then obviously you can still modify it.
Exactly, yeah. Well, the standard here works out of the box, yeah, once you've configured the variables. But of course, if you have, for whatever reason, customization needs, yeah, you can of course modify in your tenant. But this blueprint is the leading standard version that everyone can download from here and then start using. Yeah, the steps are straightforward. There's some key checking, the caching is that we mentioned about, and the call sequence that is described in detail on the blog post with a flowchart. So if someone needs to understand the specifics, the flowchart talks about the steps, yeah, and the required configurations in there. Cool. And then there's a nice table and also a guide on how to import this. Yeah, once you've downloaded, how do you import and apply? And the table talks about the parameters needed. Yeah? For instance, the Entra ID tenant ID is required to make it specific to you. Then we have an issuer check. Then there's an audience required from the Entra ID app registration, and also specifics from your S4 backend, as well as the OAuth client that Vinayak mentioned before, where you have to put your name and the required password for the user to fetch tokens, not the user that is being propagated, but only the user that is asking for tokens from the SAP OAuth server. So the blog post talks about details. We have a managed place where you can download this really well put into the ecosystem, yeah, thanks to Vinayak and the team. And from there, you can start applying. So I have added the typical demo service that everyone uses, the gateway sample basic service. So this is exposed via this integration suite and this API management instance. And it hits a cloud connector and goes to one of our R&D systems. So when we think back about the drawing at the very beginning here, so we hit API management, we go through the BTP setup to reach through the cloud connector to an S/4HANA system that runs on Azure. And we have a trust setup with my Entra ID tenant. We have the parameters configured, and on the left, we are consuming this from Power Automate. All right, so I'll be opening also Power Automate next, where we will see the configuration, and then we will actually run an update sequence where we see that Power Automate is able to change on the S4 system using principal propagation. It's using my user, and it's hitting a named SAP backend user.
Cool.
Okay, so when we go over here, this is the configuration screen where you see this is the URL that you saw before with this GW sample basic service endpoint exposed. And in here, this is the part where the magic happens. In here, we are telling Power Automate with which resource, with which app registration to make the initial request. And from there, you get the pop-up asking for your sign-in the first time. And then you have signed in with your Microsoft known identity, which can then be mapped through SAP API Management.
So basically, when I start the Power App for the very first time, I'm prompted then for my Microsoft credentials, potentially also with multi-factor authentication or whatever is configured.
Exactly.
I log in, and then from there, without entering any additional SAP credentials, I have access to my SAP system via SAP API Management and the whole token dance there.
Exactly, yeah. And some of our customers, I have had this multiple times in the past weeks, they like conditional access where they can enforce a corporate network. So because they're saying, those Power Apps, they live on the internet, I want to be able to limit this down to only the network where my IT controls it. And this is one of the ways you can achieve this.
Cool.
When you have conditional access on top of it. All right. So in here we have a simple flow that has manual trigger. It starts with reading the business partners with a top parameter. In here, I'm requesting a specific one. This is a standard SAP SE account. That's very common use. And then we're actually changing the email address of that business partner through this sequence. And we're doing this with my user context. So it's really my user that's being mapped through this sequence then. All right. So do we feel brave enough to run a test on this?
Let's give it a try. Yes. So, and I guess you have run this before, so we will not see this initial prompt for username and for the Entra ID credentials.
Yes, that's a caching thing. Yeah, of course. They will only be checking the connection if it's viable. Yeah, and then they will already run through, which can be a challenge if you've cached a wrong token. Getting rid of it requires then a couple of steps. So, because you will always be using the token that is like malicious.
Absolutely, yeah.
It says test completed. We get
all green. That's good.
Yeah, so let's have a look. So in here, I just ran a simple query off. It's telling me a bit of data with associations. Exactly, and here we got the data for the first business partner. In here, I'm specifically reading it because of the email address and ID. And in here,
make the update.
Make the update. And it gives me a status code to 100. And we were feeding it the underscore change of the email address. And when we check the read step before, we will see that we had dots, I think, before. There we go. Yeah.
Okay, nice. So we really updated the email address in the SAP system. And I mean, obviously, demoing single sign-on is not so exciting, but the cool thing is it was single sign-on. So you didn't need to provide any credentials for SAP. So the power is behind the scenes, basically.
Exactly. And now I remember, I forgot I wanted to run a quick debug session so that we actually can see that it arrived here. Clicking on it and rerunning the test so that we can still see the sequence happening. So run flow.
So you enabled debugging in SAP API Management. You're now triggering the flow again, which means Power Automate will now call SAP API Management, and we should now see all the different steps in the policy. Oh, that's small, yes. But yeah, we can see there are lots of steps.
So the last one here was the patch request, where we actually made the change. And you can then see step by step what actually happened. And in here we have the call outs to get our keys. In here we're checking then if we already have cache tokens. We have, and then we're jumping over a couple of them.
Yeah. So on a high level, I think it's complicated to go over each and every step here. But on a high level, can you guide us through what are the main steps that are happening here?
So when we get rid of the things that are preliminary and post-processing, the easiest one is to do it from here.
Yeah.
The first one checks the keys for the verification of the token that comes from Entra ID, because we want to verify on the policy if the token that is coming from Entra ID is valid. Then we are starting the lookup for the cached tokens, if we already have an SAP token. The same we do for the refresh token, so that if we have an expired token, which is expiring after an hour, we can refresh it. So API Management also does the refresh for us. In here we have the SAML2 Bira exchange request, which is the initial part of the token dance. Yeah. Taking Entra ID's token, exchanging it for SAML2 token. This is what SAP can now understand. This is the result of this sequence. And in here you can see it's all parameterized. Everything that you maintained beforehand is really dynamic in here. So you don't have to touch this ideally anymore. So you really take it as a given. You don't care about what's the complexity in there. You just maintain your values and the thing does everything for you.
And maybe it may make sense to add over here at this point, Martin, that this is not any different from the steps we've done in the previous approach as well. So at this point, it is essentially really leveraging the on behalf of extension and telling Microsoft that, hey, just give me back a token that, essentially in this case, it's a SAML token, then that will be presented to the service provider. So that's what we're doing.
Exactly, yeah. Then next, we are extracting the tokens, the responses coming from Entra ID. And then in here, we are hitting the SAP OAuth server with the results, supplying the SAML token as assertion, and telling it, please exchange this now to an OAuth token that SAP issued. And at this point, you have already won, and you have something that is viable to do the authentication later on. And the remaining steps in here are further extraction of the access token and actually caching it. So once you have one, put it on SAP's API Management cache. And in here, you actually then supply it as your final authentication means to go to the OData service. And the last one here is for CRSF token fetching. So if your consumer requires this, for instance, Power Automate doesn't, they do this for you. Many BTP apps also don't need this, but in case your app needs it, it's also here for your use. And then we have supplying of the CRSF token if needed. And the final one here defaults the format to JSON because Power Automate likes JSON, and many other apps do too. And this is also something, if you like XML better, of course, you can either disable this or drop this from your flow.
Yeah. So fantastic. And I think also that there's caching already built in, which obviously is very, very helpful, especially like if you, that you don't have to do this token exchange all the time. I think that's really, really great. But I especially also like, as I mentioned in the beginning, that this is a template ready to use. So you can just import it or apply it to your API management policy, and you're good to go.
Exactly, yep. And this is applicable to many SAP SaaS services and S4 and ECC. SuccessFactors has slight changes in this part here. That's why we are publishing another policy. And whatever other app requires this, it's just a question of like customers demanding it, and we are then we can look at more scenarios if needed. But SuccessFactors and S4 were like the most prominent ones. That's why we started with them.
And Martin, if you don't mind, I wanted to highlight one specific aspect here, which a question that we get a lot. So if you can go to the API proxy, please.
Yeah.
And if you go to the target endpoint, right? And here is where just wanted to again show the fact that of course the backend that we're connected to is abstracted via the API provider, which is usually the case. But then if you click on the API provider, and if you go to the connections, please. So you see that the authentication is set to none. Now, this is not to falsely be led into believing that it's not secure, right? And this is a question that you may get that, hey, but then you do support principal propagation. Now, what's happening? Why is this none, right? So maybe that's something that we want to clarify. Because as Martin showed, the secret sauce is really to have this handshake between the API gateway and the backend directly. And what we're doing is we're just like transparently attaching the token and then passing it along the chain, right? So we don't have to re-encrypt or we don't have to regenerate this token. And that's the reason why it's actually set to none, right? This is not to mean that it is less secure by any standards.
No, that's a super good call out. Yeah, you're right. Because I think there is basic authentication. I think there's one more that you can select.
There is principal propagation. There is principal propagation.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
But as you said, it's the pass-through, because the policy does the principal propagation. If you configure this here, you would be doing it twice, and even fail, because you have a different setup.
No, great. That's a good call.
One question, if you go, Martin, to the architectural diagram in the block. Yeah. So there for the on-premise, you have cloud connector. Okay. Basically, that would mean also you go through the firewalls, which are obviously on the on-premise. In your case, probably here or customer would have everything in Azure, meaning SAP would be in Azure, BTP would be in Azure. In such case, do you still need a cloud connector, or there is some other ways to?
No, cloud connector is not needed. SAP API Management just needs line of sight to your S4 or ECC on Azure. But it's up to you to decide how to achieve this if you don't use the cloud connector for BTP. But technically it's not needed.
Exactly. So I like the term you used, line of sight, Martin, because that's really what it all boils down to. You may actually sometimes need the cloud connector to not just need the backend, but also the combination of host and port, which could be different for the OAuth token server itself, right? So sometimes you don't have the same port. So 44300, 44301. So you may actually have to configure multiple, let's say, access controls in the cloud connector as well. But again, this all depends on line of sight. So assuming that there is no line of sight, then in which case you will need cloud connector with these configurations.
But I think a lot of customers have the SAP Cloud Connector in place because simply they are using Business Technology Platform. They have an SAP system behind a firewall, and that's where Cloud Connector is an easy solution to just connect. And I actually just recently saw and used. There's a beautiful enhancement there that in the past you had to configure everything in the SAP Cloud Connector. Like what tenant do I use? Where's my BTP sub account and whatever. And in the meantime, you can download it from BTP if you go to the destination. And you have a beautiful, we have a file there that has all the properties in there, and you just upload it to the SAP Cloud Connector, and then the connection is established. It's really nice. I mean, I was wondering for a long time why I every time need to type in, this is my trial account or whatever, and now you can just download it, the configuration file. It's really
cool. The password you still need to maintain, Holger. So it's not downloading and uploading password.
Did I need to enter? I'm not sure actually. I think it also downloaded my password actually.
No, it didn't.
Okay, I'll check this. Good, that's an action item for me now. No, perfect. I think this is really a fantastic end-to-end solution, and we know we have a lot of customers obviously that want to integrate some kind of Microsoft application, be it a Power App or a lot of other things. I mean, if we look at Teams scenarios or something like that, there's always this need for single sign-on. And I think with this setup, it's a beautiful way how you can have a secure, documented, very easy to use integration of your scenarios with a single sign-on with the SAP system. And it's great to hear that you're already working on success factors. And yeah, maybe we'll find some other SAP solution there, but I think this is really, really cool.
And Holger, I cannot but go back to some of our historical days here, because you probably remember that when we were doing Do It Enterprise, that was the first time that we actually worked with the NetWeaver team to actually get the OAuth client. So it was actually spec'd, specifically for us, and then we were the ones reviewing that spec, because usually up until that point, and a lot of customers, they still use user ID, EXT, and then the classical certificate-based approaches.
Yeah.
So for me, OAuth always holds kind of a fond place, because we actually started this in some sense.
Vinayak, not only that, you heard me talking about the SAP Business Accelerator and how great it is that the policy is there. I mean, I was one of the product managers for the SAP at that time API Business Hub, and it is so amazing to see how much it grew, and it's so great to see that we can now make policies like this available there, because I think it is a fantastic place. It has thousands of pre-configured templates for iFlows and whatever. It has the APIs documented, and now there are these policies and also policies for the API management for the Entra ID, and it's so easy to get started. It's really beautiful, and yeah, it makes me very happy to see these things continuing there.
Yes, absolutely, and maybe Martin, you already know that just because we've enabled the OAuth on the node, right? So on this backend node, that doesn't mean that you only need to go via OAuth, right? So you obviously, a customer can choose, and then he can continue using any security mechanisms that he wants to get into the backend. So we're just kind of telling that we've enabled OAuth additionally for this node. So, and that always helps, right? To have multiple configurations all available. Yeah. And it's really up to the customer to choose which one they would want at what point of time.
Exactly.
Well, fantastic. Thank you so much to both of you for working on this, for presenting it today. And I really hope to see both of you again in the future. Maybe with the success factors scenario, maybe with something else, would be really great.
Looking forward.
Okay. Absolutely. Absolutely. And as Martin said, right, so we still have the policy template for success factors coming in. So, please hold on to your horses. We'll have that out in no time.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Ciao.